Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts reach and at what times of day or night. The year was 1844, when the Monroe Plantation stood as one of the most prosperous estates in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. The main house, with its imposing white columns and sprawling veranda, overlooked acres of cotton fields that stretched toward the horizon like an ocean of white gold. What happened there on the evening of September 23rd would eventually be spoken about in hushed tones throughout the parish for decades to come, though official records would remain curiously incomplete. Silas Monroe had inherited the plantation from his father just 2 years prior, at the age of 26. Unlike the elder Monroe, who'd been known for his harsh management and frequent public displays of cruelty, Silas cultivated an image of modernity and restraint. He had been educated in the North at Harvard before returning to claim his birthright. The locals regarded him with a mixture of respect and suspicion, a young master with northern ideas yet southern blood. His marriage to Esther Dubois, daughter of a wealthy New Orleans merchant, had been celebrated with much fanfare throughout the parish. She brought with her not only a considerable dowry, but the refined airs of New Orleans society. Fair-haired and slender, with a perpetual half-smile that never quite reached her eyes, Esther quickly established herself as the mistress of Monroe Plantation. The couple appeared, by all accounts, to represent the pinnacle of Southern aristocracy. But appearances, as they so often do, concealed darker truths. The household staff consisted of 43 enslaved persons, including house servants and field workers. Among them was Jeremiah, an elderly man who had been on the plantation since before Silas was born. According to the few surviving accounts, Jeremiah served primarily in the main house, responsible for maintenance and occasional service during social gatherings. Parish records indicate he would have been approximately 70 years of age in 1844, though precise birth records for enslaved individuals were notoriously unreliable during this period. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not merely what occurred, but how thoroughly it was subsequently erased from official documentation. Were it not for a collection of personal letters discovered during a renovation of the old parish courthouse in 1962, this story might never have come to light at all. The day began like any other on the plantation. According to weather records from a neighboring property, it was unusually hot for late September, with stifling humidity that clung to the skin like a damp cloth. The cotton harvest was in full swing, with field workers laboring from dawn until dusk. Inside the main house, preparations were underway for a dinner party scheduled for the following evening, an opportunity for Silas and Esther to entertain local dignitaries and further cement their social standing. Jeremiah had been tasked with polishing the silver service, a tedious job that required meticulous attention to detail. The parlor where he worked overlooked the side garden, a carefully manicured space featuring imported roses and a small fountain. The windows were open to catch what little breeze might stir the heavy air. It was here, amid the gleaming silver and the distant sound of the fountain, that the first act of our tragedy would unfold. Esther Monroe's day had not gone according to plan. The dressmaker in town had failed to complete alterations to her new gown in time for the upcoming dinner party. The menu she had carefully planned had to be revised when the butcher could not provide the promised cuts of meat. And now, as she returned to the house, irritable from the heat and frustrated by these complications, she found Jeremiah's progress with the silver unsatisfactory. What happened next exists in fragments. A serving girl named Martha provided testimony years later, speaking to her granddaughter, who eventually recorded the account in 1928. According to this source, Martha had been dusting in the adjacent room when she heard Esther's voice rise in anger. The sound of silver clattering to the floor was followed by what she described as a thwacking sound, like a wet sheet against stone during washing. Silas Munro had been meeting with his overseer near the cotton gin when a house servant came running to fetch him. According to a letter he later wrote to his cousin in Virginia, he returned to the house immediately, entering through the side door that led directly to the parlor. What he witnessed there would alter the course of multiple lives. Esther stood over Jeremiah, who had fallen to his knees. In her hand was a silver-backed hairbrush, its handle stained with what appeared to be blood. Jeremiah's face showed evidence of multiple blows, his left eye swollen shut, a thin stream of blood tracing a path from his temple to his jaw. The account of what transpired in that moment varies depending on the source. In Silas's letter, he claims to have immediately intervened, physically restraining his wife and ordering her to her quarters. In Martha's recollection, however, Silas stood frozen for several long seconds, his expression unreadable, before quietly telling Jeremiah to go to the kitchen and have his wounds tended to. What is not disputed is what followed in the coming days. The dinner party scheduled for the following evening was abruptly cancelled, with guests receiving notes citing illness in the household. Esther was not seen outside the main house for nearly 2 weeks. When she did resume her social engagements, observers noted a marked change in her demeanor, the half-smile replaced by a tightness around her mouth, her conversation stilted and formal. Jeremiah continued his duties, though he was reassigned to the stables and outbuildings, no longer working in the main house. The physical evidence of his beating faded, but according to kitchen staff, he became increasingly withdrawn, speaking only when directly addressed. As for Silas, his behavior underwent the most dramatic transformation. The young plantation owner began spending extended hours in his study, often working by lamplight until the early hours of the morning. He conducted thorough inventories of the plantation's accounts and assets. He wrote numerous letters, though to whom remains unknown, as only the one to his Virginia cousin survives. In early October, barely 2 weeks after the incident, Silas made an unprecedented journey to New Orleans, where court records indicate he met with a lawyer named Francois Beaumont. The nature of their business was not officially recorded, though subsequent events suggest its purpose. Upon his return from New Orleans, Silas called for a gathering of all household staff. According to Martha's account, he stood on the back porch of the main house, his expression grave as he addressed the assembled group. No direct quotation of his speech survives, but the substance of his announcement sent shockwaves through the plantation. He intended to begin the process of manumission for Jeremiah, granting him freedom and providing him with a small stipend to establish himself elsewhere. Such an action was highly unusual in 1844 Louisiana, where laws regarding manumission had been made increasingly restrictive. The political climate strongly discouraged the freeing of enslaved persons, with substantial legal obstacles in place. Yet Silas appeared determined to pursue this course of action, regardless of potential social and economic consequences. Esther's reaction to this announcement was not recorded in any surviving document. However, her absence from the gathering was noted by multiple sources. That evening, according to a kitchen servant's later recollection, raised voices could be heard from the master bedroom, though the specific content of the argument remained indistinct. The following morning, Esther Munro was gone. A brief note left on her dressing table informed Silas that she had returned to her family in New Orleans. She took with her only personal items, leaving behind household furnishings and the majority of her wardrobe. Plantation records indicate that 2 male house servants accompanied her on the journey, though their names were not specified. What might have remained a private marital dispute soon became public knowledge throughout St. Landry Parish. Esther's father, Guillaume Dubois, arrived at the plantation 3 days later, accompanied by 2 associates described in Silas's letter as men of legal appearance. Their conversation took place behind closed doors, but the outcome became evident in subsequent days. Silas abandoned his plans regarding Jeremiah's manumission. Parish records indicate no further legal actions were pursued. Jeremiah remained at the Monroe plantation, though his duties were permanently reassigned to the outer buildings and fields, removing him from the main house entirely. More significantly, Esther returned to the plantation approximately 2 weeks after her departure. Her reappearance was marked by a church service at the local parish, where observers noted the couple's rigid posture and minimal interaction despite sharing a pew. Life at the Monroe plantation appeared to resume its previous rhythm, but those who worked closely with the household reported a palpable tension that permeated every interaction between Silas and Esther. They maintained separate bedrooms, dined together only when hosting guests, and communicated primarily through servants rather than directly. Jeremiah's situation, while technically unchanged in legal terms, underwent subtle alterations. According to plantation work records, his duties were made less physically demanding, appropriate to his advanced age. He was provided with improved quarters and exempted from working during periods of extreme weather. While these changes might seem modest by modern standards, within the context of plantation life in 1844 Louisiana, they represented significant accommodations. The most telling document from this period is a fragment of Silas's personal journal, discovered among the courthouse papers in 1962. The entry, dated November 12, 1844, reads simply, "I have made my compromise with hell. May God forgive what I cannot undo." Winter came to St. Landry Parish, bringing with it a social season of parties and gatherings. The Monroes participated as expected, hosting and attending events with the appropriate display of wealth and hospitality. Yet observers consistently noted the strange dynamic between husband and wife, a coldness that seemed at odds with their immaculate appearance and formal correctness. In February of 1845, Jeremiah fell ill with what was described as winter fever. Plantation medical records, maintained by the local physician who attended to valuable enslaved persons, indicate symptoms consistent with pneumonia. His condition deteriorated rapidly, as was common with elderly patients in that era before antibiotics. What happened next represents perhaps the most perplexing element of this entire case. Against all convention, Silas Monroe moved Jeremiah from the quarters where he had been resting into a guest bedroom in the main house. He arranged for round-the-clock attendance by house servants and paid for daily visits from the physician. Such care for an elderly enslaved person was virtually unprecedented and caused considerable gossip throughout the parish. Esther's reaction to this arrangement was not directly recorded, but household staff reported that she refused to enter the wing of the house where Jeremiah was being treated. She took her meals separately during this period and was frequently observed sitting alone in the garden gazebo, even on chilly February days when such behavior seemed peculiar. Despite the unusual level of care provided, Jeremiah's condition continued to worsen. On February 23, 1845, he passed away in the guest bedroom of the Monroe Plantation house. According to Martha's later account, Silas was present at the moment of death, having spent much of the previous night sitting beside the bed. What followed diverged even further from typical practices of the time. Rather than a hasty burial in the unmarked area where enslaved persons were typically interred, Silas arranged for Jeremiah to be buried at the edge of the family cemetery in a marked grave with a simple stone bearing his name and dates. While not placed within the Monroe family plot itself, the location nevertheless represented an extraordinary acknowledgement. The parish priest, Father Thomas Beauregard, initially refused to perform funeral rites for Jeremiah in the same manner as he would for white parishioners. According to church records, Silas made a substantial donation to the parish building fund the day before the funeral. Father Beauregard subsequently conducted a brief but proper service. Esther did not attend the funeral. Household records indicate she remained in her room throughout the day, having meals delivered by servants. The following day, she resumed her normal activities as if nothing unusual had occurred. By spring, the incident might have faded from parish memory, becoming merely another whispered story among many. But in March of 1845, Guillaume Dubois died suddenly in New Orleans, reportedly from apoplexy. As Esther's only living parent, his death necessitated her presence in the city to attend the funeral and address matters of inheritance. She departed the plantation on March 15th, accompanied by her personal maid and a male servant. According to Silas's letter to his cousin, the parting was cordial but distant. He did not accompany her to New Orleans, citing plantation business that required his attention. 2 weeks passed without word from New Orleans, then 3. By the end of April, when Esther should have long since returned, Silas finally wrote to her family's address in the city. The response from the family lawyer was brief and bewildering. Esther had never arrived in New Orleans. What followed was a frantic search that spread across multiple parishes. Silas hired private investigators and offered substantial rewards for information. Advertisements appeared in newspapers throughout Louisiana and neighboring states. The servants who had accompanied Esther were also missing, with no trace of their passage found along the known routes to New Orleans. As weeks stretched into months with no resolution, speculation ran rampant. Some suggested Esther had fled north, perhaps even to Canada, though her motivations for such a drastic action remained unclear. Others whispered darker possibilities. Robbery and violence along the roads were not uncommon, despite the servants' presence as protection. Silas's behavior during this period became increasingly erratic. He was observed walking the plantation grounds at night, lantern in hand. He made multiple trips to New Orleans, returning each time more haggard than before. Plantation operations began to suffer from his inattention, with the overseer assuming more day-to-day authority. In September of 1845, exactly 1 year after the initial incident with Jeremiah, Silas Monroe disappeared. He left no note, no explanation. Plantation records simply show that on the morning of September 23rd, he did not emerge from his study where he had been working through the night. When servants finally entered the room late that afternoon, they found it empty, the French doors standing open to the garden. A thorough search of the plantation and surrounding areas yielded nothing. Like Esther before him, Silas Monroe had vanished without trace. The legal complications that ensued were substantial. With both owners missing but not officially declared dead, the plantation fell into a state of limbo. Eventually, after the legally required 7 years had passed with no word from either Silas or Esther, the courts declared them deceased in absentia. The property passed to a distant Monroe cousin from Virginia, who sold it shortly thereafter. The story might have ended there, consigned to parish rumors and eventually forgotten, were it not for a discovery made in 1958. During the construction of a highway extension near the former Monroe plantation, workers excavating an area approximately 2 miles from the old main house uncovered human remains. Forensic examination, limited by the technology of the time, determined them to be of a woman and 2 men, estimated to have been buried for approximately 100 years. The female skeleton showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. One male skeleton had a similar injury pattern, while the other appeared to have suffered a broken neck. Their clothing had long since decomposed, but buttons and personal items suggested attire consistent with the mid-19th century. A corroded silver locket was found among the female remains, containing a miniature portrait too damaged for identification. While no definitive link to Esther Monroe and her accompanying servants could be established, The location, estimated time of burial, and number of bodies led many to draw the obvious conclusion. The case file remained open but inactive, the remains eventually reburied in the parish cemetery with a marker noting only the estimated date of death and the circumstances of discovery. The final chapter of this dark history came in 1962 with the courthouse renovation that revealed the collection of documents referenced throughout this account. Among these papers was a sealed envelope addressed in what handwriting experts later confirmed was Silas Munro's script. The envelope was marked, "To be opened in the event of my death or disappearance." Inside was a single page, its contents both cryptic and disturbing. The letter read, in part, "What I have done with full knowledge of its consequence to my immortal soul. I could not bear to see justice denied, nor could I bring myself to destroy what remained of my life and name through public action. May God and Jeremiah forgive me, though I cannot forgive myself. She waits for me now on the North Path, as agreed. By the time this is read, I will have met my judgment." The North Path mentioned in the letter was never conclusively identified. The former plantation had, by 1962, been divided and developed into multiple properties, the original road system largely obliterated by modern construction. Local historians speculated that Silas may have arranged to meet someone, perhaps an accomplice, at a predetermined location, though the identity of this person and the nature of their agreement remains unknown. Others suggested a more metaphysical interpretation, that Silas believed he was going to meet Esther, or perhaps her spirit, to receive some form of retribution. What seems most plausible, given the evidence available, is that Silas Munro was somehow involved in the deaths of Esther and her servants, whether directly or through hired intermediaries. The location of the discovered remains, on what would have been plantation property but well away from traveled roads, suggests a deliberate choice of an isolated burial site. His subsequent disappearance, timed exactly 1 year after the incident that set these events in motion, suggests either a planned escape to avoid potential discovery of his actions, or perhaps suicide at a location that remains undiscovered. The Munro plantation house itself stood vacant for several years after the cousins sold the property. It was eventually destroyed by fire in 1867, in what the local newspaper described as a conflagration of unknown origin. Nothing remains of the structure today except the stone foundation, barely visible beneath decades of vegetation. The grave marker for Jeremiah, however, can still be found in what remains of the old plantation cemetery. Weathered by time and partially obscured by moss, the simple stone bears only a name and 2 dates. It stands as perhaps the only tangible evidence of this complex and tragic history. Visitors to the area occasionally report an oppressive sense of melancholy near the former plantation grounds, particularly around dusk when the Louisiana humidity hangs heavy in the air. Whether this represents some form of psychological response to knowing the site's history or something more cannot be definitively stated. What we can say with certainty is that beneath the carefully maintained facade of antebellum gentility lay currents of cruelty, retribution, and moral compromise. The story of Silas Munro, Esther Dubois, and Jeremiah reveals how even small fractures in that facade could ultimately lead to complete collapse. The parish records for 1845 note an unusually wet autumn with flooding that damaged crops throughout the region. They make no mention of the human tragedies unfolding at the Munro plantation. Such silence was, perhaps, the most telling aspect of all. The systematic erasure of uncomfortable truths that challenge the established order. Today, the land where these events took place has been transformed beyond recognition. Modern homes and businesses stand where cotton once grew. The descendants of those involved have scattered across the country, many likely unaware of their connection to this dark chapter of Louisiana history. Yet something of the story persists in fragmented documents, in archaeological evidence, and in the collective memory of a place that has witnessed both the best and worst of human nature. It reminds us that beneath the surface of even the most seemingly ordered societies, currents of violence and retribution may flow, unseen until they suddenly breach the surface. The last known document relating to this case is a brief entry in the journal of Father Thomas Beauregard, dated December 24, 1845. It reads simply, "Prayed today for the souls of S. and E. Monroe and for old Jeremiah. May God have more mercy on them all than they had for each other. Some sins, I fear, leave marks upon the very land where they were committed." Whether the priest knew more than he committed to writing remains yet another unanswered question in this troubling narrative. Like so many aspects of this case, the full truth has vanished into the mists of history, leaving us with fragments from which we must construct an incomplete picture. And perhaps that incompleteness is fitting. For the story of the Monroe Plantation is, at its heart, about the gaps in our understanding, the silences where truth should speak, the empty spaces where justice should stand. It is about what happens when those gaps are finally partially filled, and how the revelations can shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew. As you drive through St. Landry Parish today, you might pass the unmarked location where these events unfolded without any awareness of its significance. Time and development have erased the physical evidence, but the story remains, a whisper from the past about the consequences of cruelty, the price of retribution, and the weight of secrets carried to the grave. The sound that still echoes after all these years is not a scream or a shout, but rather the heavy silence that follows when terrible truths are buried too deep to be spoken aloud. In 1963, a year after the discovery of Silas Monroe's letter, a graduate student from Tulane University named Margaret Fontenot began researching the case for her doctoral dissertation on undocumented violence in antebellum Louisiana. Her work took her through parish records, newspaper archives, and private collections throughout the state. What she uncovered added yet another layer to this already complex narrative. Among the papers of Dr. James Whitfield, the physician who had attended Jeremiah during his final illness, Fontenot discovered a small leather-bound notebook containing personal observations not included in his official medical records. The entry dated February 22, 1845, the day before Jeremiah's death, contained a disturbing passage. "Visited Monroe Plantation again today. The old man J grows weaker by the hour. In a moment of lucidity, he beckoned me closer and spoke words that chill me even now as I record them. 'She did not beat me for dropping the silver,' he whispered. 'She beat me for what I saw her place in Master Silas's evening tea the night before.' When I pressed him for clarification, his eyes grew fearful, and he would say no more. I have not shared this with SM, as I cannot determine if this represents delirium or something more sinister. May God guide me in this matter." The subsequent page had been torn from the notebook, leaving this tantalizing fragment without resolution. Dr. Whitfield died in 1852, taking whatever decision he made to his grave. This revelation cast the entire sequence of events in a new and more troubling light. If Jeremiah had indeed witnessed Esther attempting to poison her husband, it would explain both her violent reaction when discovered and Silas's subsequent behavior. The elaborate care provided to Jeremiah during his final illness might have been motivated not merely by guilt over his mistreatment, but by gratitude for potentially saving Silas's life. Fontenot's research also led her to descendants of Martha, the serving girl whose testimony provided crucial details about the events at the Monroe Plantation. Through these connections, she obtained access to family stories passed down through generations, including details never recorded in official documents. According to these oral histories, Martha had observed Esther engaged in secretive behavior for weeks before the incident with Jeremiah. On multiple occasions, she was seen conversing intently with a male visitor who arrived when Silas was known to be away from the property. This visitor never came to the front entrance, but was met by Esther near the old sugar house at the plantation's eastern boundary. Martha had described the man as well-dressed but not gentlemanly, with a distinctive scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. She had mentioned this visitor to Jeremiah, who reportedly warned her to see nothing, know nothing, and speak nothing if she wished to remain safe. The identity of this mysterious visitor was never established. However, Fontenot uncovered a possible connection in New Orleans police records from 1843, which mentioned a man named Jean Lafitte, no relation to the famous privateer, who was known to provide discretionary services to wealthy clients. His physical description included a facial scar matching Martha's account, and he was known to have connections with certain elements of New Orleans society, including associates of the Dubois family. The possibility that Esther had been planning her husband's murder for some time, perhaps with the assistance of a hired killer, adds a premeditated dimension to what might otherwise be seen as a spontaneous act of cruelty toward Jeremiah. It suggests that the beating was not merely an outburst of temper, but a desperate attempt to silence a witness who could have exposed a far more serious crime. This interpretation also casts Silas's subsequent actions in a different light. His initial attempt to free Jeremiah, followed by the compromise reached after Guillaume Dubois' intervention, suggests a man caught between gratitude, justice, and the social constraints of his time and place. The compromise with hell mentioned in his journal likely referred to his decision to remain married to a woman he now knew had attempted to murder him, maintaining the appearance of a proper household while living in constant awareness of the danger she represented. Fontenot's research was further complicated by the discovery of correspondence between Silas Monroe and a northern abolitionist named Frederick Holloway, dating from 1843, predating the incidents described in this account. These letters, found in the archives of an anti-slavery society in Boston, revealed that Silas had been engaged in confidential discussions regarding the gradual manumission of all enslaved persons on his plantation, with plans to convert the property to paid labor over a period of years. Such intentions, if made public in 1843 Louisiana, would have resulted in Silas's complete ostracization from society and possibly placed him in physical danger. The letters indicate that he was proceeding with extreme caution, confiding his plans to no one locally, not even his wife. This revelation suggests a possible motive for Esther's apparent murder attempt, distinct from the personal animosity described in parish gossip. If she had somehow discovered her husband's abolitionist leanings, perhaps through intercepted correspondence, she might have seen him as a threat not only to her way of life, but to the entire social order upon which her privilege depended. The timing of events becomes particularly significant in this context. The incident with Jeremiah occurred in September 1844, approximately 6 months after the last dated letter between Silas and Holloway. This gap could indicate that their correspondence had been discovered, prompting Esther's desperate action. Following this line of investigation, Fontenot examined the financial records of the Dubois family business in New Orleans, which revealed a pattern of increasing financial distress in the early 1840s. Guillaume Dubois had made several high-risk investments that failed to yield the expected returns, placing the family's fortune in jeopardy. Esther's marriage to Silas Monroe, with his substantial plantation holdings, had represented financial salvation as much as a social alliance. The prospect of her husband freeing valuable enslaved workers, thereby dramatically reducing the plantation's worth, would have threatened not only Esther's personal comfort, but her family's solvency. This economic motivation, combined with the social stigma that would have attached to being married to a known abolitionist sympathizer, presents a compelling reason for the extreme measures she apparently contemplated. Returning to the events following Jeremiah's death, Fontenot's research uncovered additional details about Esther's final journey. Parish road records indicated that a bridge along the main route to New Orleans had been damaged by heavy rains in the week before her departure, necessitating a detour through less traveled roads near what was then undeveloped swampland, precisely the area where the 3 sets of remains were discovered in 1958. A further connection emerged through courthouse records of a land dispute filed in 1846. A property owner near the detour route reported in his deposition that in March of the previous year he had observed a gentleman on horseback, well-dressed but riding hard, along the rarely used road. He had found this notable enough to mention to his wife, as few travelers of apparent means used that difficult route when the main road was available. The description of the rider, while vague, contained one detail that resonated with Martha's account of Esther's mysterious visitor. The man was described as having a marked face, as if from an old wound. The timing of this sighting, corresponding approximately to Esther's journey, suggests the possible involvement of the same individual in whatever befell her and her servants. If Silas had indeed arranged for the murder of his wife, whether through the same hired killer she had apparently employed against him or through some other agency, it would explain his subsequent behavior. The guilt expressed in his letter, his increasing instability, and his final disappearance on the anniversary of the original incident with Jeremiah form a coherent, if disturbing, psychological progression. Yet this narrative leaves several questions unanswered. Why would Silas wait 6 months after Jeremiah's death to disappear? What prompted him to act when he did? And what became of him after that September day when he walked out of his study and into oblivion? A partial answer may lie in a discovery Fontenot made in the archives of a small newspaper published in San Francisco. An article dated January 1846 mentioned the arrival of a SM from Louisiana who had purchased property in the growing city with the intention of establishing an import business. The brief item noted that the gentleman declined to be interviewed, expressing a desire for privacy after recent troubles. While far from conclusive, this tantalizing reference suggests the possibility that Silas Monroe did not meet his end in Louisiana, but instead crafted a new identity thousands of miles away. If so, the letter left in the courthouse, with its suggestions of guilt and impending judgment, may have been a deliberate misdirection intended to discourage any search for him. The California connection received unexpected support from another source. In 1868, a book titled Reflections on Conscience and Redemption was published in San Francisco under the name Solomon Mercer. The volume, primarily a philosophical and theological meditation on guilt and atonement, contained passages that bore striking similarities to the writing style found in Silas Monroe's surviving letters. More significantly, the book's preface made reference to events in Louisiana some 25 years past that had led the author to profound consideration of justice, both human and divine. While no specific incidents were described, the timing aligns perfectly with the Monroe Plantation tragedy. If Silas did indeed escape to California and establish a new life as Solomon Mercer, it suggests a man torn between the desire to flee the consequences of his actions and the need to process his guilt through philosophical abstraction. The publication date of the book, 1868, 1 year after the Monroe Plantation house burned to the ground, might indicate a psychological milestone, a point at which he felt sufficiently removed from his past to engage with it, albeit obliquely. Fontenot's dissertation, completed in 1965, proposed this interpretation as one possible resolution to the mystery of Silas Munro's disappearance. However, she was careful to note the circumstantial nature of the evidence, acknowledging that the connection between Silas Munro and Solomon Mercer remained speculative. The dissertation received little attention outside academic circles, and Fontenot herself moved on to other areas of research. The story might have faded entirely from public consciousness were it not for an unusual discovery made in 1967. During the demolition of an old building in San Francisco that had once housed the offices of Solomon Mercer's publishing company, workers found a sealed metal box concealed within a wall cavity. Inside was a packet of letters, a small leather-bound journal, and a tarnished silver locket containing a miniature portrait of a woman whose features bore a striking resemblance to descriptions of Esther Dubois Monroe. The journal, while never explicitly identifying its author as Silas Munro, contained entries that aligned with known events at the plantation. More significantly, it included a detailed account of the writer's journey from Louisiana to California, traveling under assumed names and taking a circuitous route to avoid detection. The most revealing entry, dated September 23, 1845, the day of Silas's disappearance, read, "I leave behind today all that I was. The land that has been in my family for generations will pass to others' hands. The name I have carried will be spoken no more. Even the sin that drives me from this place will remain unconfessed in any court of man. Yet I go not to escape judgment, but to seek it in a lifetime of atonement. J saved my life, though he could not save my soul. E sought to take my life, and I have taken hers in return. The cycle of violence, begun in the very foundations of this corrupt society, continues unbroken, perhaps in a distant place where men are valued for their works rather than their birthright. I may find some measure of peace." The authenticity of this journal has been debated among historians, with some suggesting it may be an elaborate hoax created to capitalize on the enduring fascination with the Monroe case. However, handwriting analysis conducted in 1968 concluded that there was a high probability that the journal was written by the same hand that penned Silas Munro's known correspondence. If genuine, this document provides the clearest confession to date of Silas's involvement in Esther's death. The phrase, "I have taken hers in return," leaves little room for alternative interpretations. Yet even here, questions remain. Did he commit the act himself or employ others? Was it planned in advance or an opportunity seized in the moment? And what of the two servants who died alongside her? The journal offers no explicit answers to these questions. However, the tone of the writing suggests a man who views himself not as a murderer, but as an instrument of justice, flawed, compromised, but ultimately serving some greater moral balance. The reference to seeking judgment in a lifetime of atonement indicates that, whatever the specifics of his actions, he did not consider Esther's death as absolving him of guilt, but rather as creating a new burden of responsibility. This perspective aligns with the philosophical themes explored in Reflections on Conscience and Redemption, strengthening the connection between Silas Munro and Solomon Mercer. The book repeatedly examines the concept that justice achieved through unjust means creates a moral debt that can never be fully repaid, a theme that would resonate deeply with a man who had arranged or committed murder, even if he believed the victim deserved her fate. The final piece of this historical puzzle emerged in 1969, when an elderly woman named Sarah Mercer contacted Tulane University after reading about Fontenot's research in a newspaper article. She identified herself as the granddaughter of Solomon Mercer and offered access to family papers that had never been made public. Among these documents was a letter written by Solomon Mercer to his son in 1880, with instructions that it be opened only after his death. In this letter, Mercer acknowledged that he had been born Silas Monroe in Louisiana and had fled that state after taking actions that violated God's law but fulfilled what I believed to be his justice. The letter confirmed much of what had been speculated, that Silas had discovered Esther's attempt to poison him through Jeremiah's warning, that he had initially sought legal means to separate from her while providing for Jeremiah's freedom, that Guillaume Dubois had threatened to expose Silas's abolitionist leanings if he pursued either course of action, and that following Jeremiah's death from natural causes, Silas had arranged for Esther to be intercepted on her journey to New Orleans. What the letter added was a level of detail previously unknown. Silas claimed not to have been present at Esther's death, having hired the same man she had earlier employed against him, Jean Lafitte, the scarred agent from New Orleans. According to Silas, he had instructed Lafitte only to ensure that Esther never reached New Orleans, suggesting that she be taken to Texas or Mexico and left there with sufficient funds to establish herself, but insufficient means to return. "What happened on that road," Silas wrote, "exceeded my instructions and my intentions. When I learned that E and both servants had been killed, I was overcome with horror at what my actions had set in motion. Though I had not ordered their deaths, I had created the circumstances that led to 3 souls being sent prematurely to their Maker. This knowledge has been my constant companion through the years, a weight that no success or charitable work can ever fully lift." The letter went on to describe his carefully planned escape, his journey to California, and his establishment of a new identity as Solomon Mercer. In San Francisco, he had built a successful import business and eventually married a widow named Catherine Wells, with whom he had 2 children. He had used a portion of his wealth to support abolitionist causes anonymously, and after the Civil War to fund educational initiatives for formerly enslaved persons, actions he characterized as inadequate but necessary attempts at atonement. He concluded the letter with a request for forgiveness from his children and grandchildren for the deception that had shaped their family history, expressing hope that they would judge him not only by the worst action of my life, but by the sum of my efforts to make amends for it. Sarah Mercer reported that her father had honored Solomon's wishes, keeping the secret until his own death in 1920. She had learned the truth as a young woman, but had seen no reason to make it public until learning of academic interest in the case. Now, in her 70s, she felt the time had come for the full story to be known. The verification of Sarah Mercer's documents, combined with the journal found in San Francisco and the evidence uncovered by Fontenot, provides as complete a picture as we are likely ever to have of the events at Monroe Plantation and their aftermath. Yet even with these revelations, aspects of the story remain shadowed in ambiguity. The true nature of Jeremiah's relationship with Silas, whether one of genuine concern or mere utility, cannot be definitively established. The specific circumstances of Esther's death, including the role of Jean Lafitte and the reason for the servants' murders, remain matters of speculation, and the full extent of Silas's abolitionist activities, including whether they were motivated by moral conviction or pragmatic calculation, continues to be debated among historians. What emerges clearly, however, is a narrative far more complex than a simple morality tale. The initial incident, a young plantation master discovering his wife beating an elderly enslaved person, opened into a spiral of secrecy, retribution, and guilt that ultimately claimed multiple lives and altered countless others. The facade of antebellum propriety concealed depths of human complexity that defy easy categorization as heroism or villainy. Today, the former Monroe Plantation land has been developed into a suburban community. The small cemetery where Jeremiah was buried has been preserved as a historical site, though few visitors understand the full significance of the simple stone marker bearing his name. The location where Esther and her servants were found has been incorporated into a highway rest area, with no indication of its grim history. In San Francisco, the business Solomon Mercer founded continued under different ownership until 1947. The building that housed his publishing company was replaced by a modern office structure in the late 1960s. His descendants, now aware of their connection to Louisiana history, have chosen to maintain their privacy, granting interviews only occasionally to serious researchers. The documents that tell this story, letters, journals, official records, and oral histories, are scattered across archives in Louisiana, California, and private collections. Together, they offer glimpses into the lives of individuals caught in a moral and social system that corrupted even those who sought to stand apart from it. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for this complex history comes from Reflections on Conscience and Redemption, in a passage that seems to speak directly to Silas Monroe's experience. The gravest danger in confronting evil is not that we may fail to overcome it, but that in our struggle against darkness we may come to embody the very shadow we sought to banish. True redemption begins with the recognition that the line between justice and vengeance is often finest precisely when we are most certain of our righteousness. As the sun sets over St. Landry Parish, casting long shadows across landscapes transformed by time and development, the echoes of these events fade, but never quite disappear. They remain as whispers in archives, as questions in academic journals, and as the barely perceptible weight of history that settles upon places where human drama has played out in all its complexity. The story of Silas Monroe, Esther Dubois, and Jeremiah reminds us that beneath the carefully constructed narratives of history lie human beings, flawed and contradictory, capable of both terrible cruelty and surprising compassion. It teaches us that moral certainty is often an illusion, that justice and injustice can spring from the same source, and that the consequences of our actions may reach far beyond our intentions or expectations. In the end, perhaps the greatest value in reconstructing such narratives lies not in passing judgment on those involved, but in recognizing our shared humanity across the divisions of time and circumstance. For in understanding the complexities that shape the lives of those who came before us, we may gain insight into the forces that continue to shape our own. As this account draws to a close, we leave Silas Monroe, or Solomon Mercer, to the judgment of history and whatever divine reckoning he may have faced. We leave Esther to the mystery that still partially shrouds her motives and her fate. And we leave Jeremiah, whose warning sparked this chain of events, to the dignity of memory that was denied to so many in his position. The sound that still echoes after all these years is not a scream or a shout, but rather the heavy silence that follows when terrible truths are buried too deep to be spoken aloud. It is in breaking that silence, in excavating these buried stories with care and compassion, that we honor both the suffering and the humanity of those who lived them.